Throughout history, American minorities have been treated very poorly by majority groups such as white men. Along with the short-term effects of being discriminated, such as being segregated, there are many long-term effects that these actions have as well. One area that has been impacted heavily by this cruelty is in schools, and particularly the education gap between minorities and whites. For example, in modern schools that have a predominantly white population, it is apparent that the funding for these schools is higher, and the education that they are receiving is most often better than a school that has mostly minorities. It is apparent that segregation and education equality has occurred through events such as Plessy v. Ferguson, Brown v. Board of Education, and the Little Rock Nine. The idea that segregation could exist while being legal in the United States was first challenged in 1896 in the court case Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson was based off of a controversial law passed in Louisiana that ruled that railway cars should provide separate accommodations for other races. The case saw African-American citizen Homer Plessy, who filed a petition against the judge, John Ferguson, claiming that the law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This was eventually taken to the Supreme Court, where they decided in a 7-1 decision that whites and people of color should remain separate but equal. Plessy v. Ferguson laid the groundwork for segregation to happen virtually anywhere, and it became commonplace in schools at the time.
One of the first steps towards ending school segregation on a national level was Brown v. Board of Education. These trials were brought to the Supreme Court with the help of NAACP lawyer Marshall Thurgood. The court ruled that we conclude in a field of public education on the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. While some schools desegregated peacefully, many, especially in the South, were met with great hostility. Local governments denied court ruling and kept schools segregated out of sheer disobedience to the Supreme Court. Also, the federal government didn't take much immediate action against this disobedience, as other pressing national issues such as protests and boycotts took the attention of lawmakers.
In 1957, a group of 9 African-American teenagers enrolled at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. This group was known as the Little Rock Nine. The Little Rock Nine had many troubles getting into the school. The first attempt to go in was stopped by the governor of Arkansas. The governor did this by using the National Guard to preserve the peace, who were really there to keep the school segregated. The next attempt, they successfully started attending Central High with the support of the National Guard, who was used by President Eisenhower to ensure they got in safely. The kids would get bullied by white students even though they were protected by the National Guard. The desegregation was possible because of the decision of the Supreme Court in Brown versus the Board of Education. Ernest Green, who was the only kid to graduate from Central High because of Governor Orville's decision to shut down all the schools in an attempt to keep the schools segregated, which worked. The Little Rock Nine played a major role in getting the desegregation of schools started, but the effect wasn't as immediate as the NAACP was hoping for.
In modern times, the educational funding gap is still a huge problem for many school districts. On average, school districts with the largest percentage of Latino or Black students receive around 13% less funding than school districts with the least students of color. This disparity of funding is widespread, and the impacts are devastating for students. There are many cases of the government neglect, especially when it comes to economics, towards schools with a high minority population. For example, in a 2015 case study done by Penn State of an inner-city school in Detroit, shows the effects of underfunding to schools. The infrastructure and the building itself are in need of a lot of renovations and repairs, but there is insufficient funding to do so. There is mold and broken appliances, making the school an unsafe environment for the students. Not only is the building itself an issue, but also the food fed to students is rotten and subpar to standards. Usually for poor inner city students, the only time they eat food is at school, and if the food at school is not sanitary or up to standards, then students suffer the health consequences, which leads to bad grades and subpar proficiency in learning. All these factors combined create an unsafe and non-nurturing learning environment for the vulnerable students of Detroit. Solution 1. The state and federal government should be more involved with the finances and budgeting of the school districts, as local governments are sometimes incompetent with spreading funds. We should eliminate the economic segregation between school districts so that all kids have an equal chance to opportunities. By allowing the state and federal governments to evenly distribute the funds to school districts, this sets an even playing field for both white and students of color alike. Solution 2. Another way for school districts to generate extra revenue is through advertising. That way, this benefits both the schools and the companies that target students or the younger generation. Schools will be able to choose and carefully select which ads have a message they want being spread in their schools, and also gain extra cash for whatever the school needs funds for. On the other side, companies that target students will be able to more efficiently spread their product and advertise them towards kids, which will in turn stimulate the economy.
In conclusion, it can be seen that throughout history, schools have been the center of conversation, especially when it comes to equal funding for all schools. Whether a school is a majority black, white, Hispanic, or any race for that matter, every student should receive the same opportunities in education.